5 centuries of silence, and then the sound of his heart's own echo trying to kill him. It began not with a thunderous declaration of war, but with a whisper of displaced air in the cavernous throne room. Caius, king of the Night's Court, lord of 1,000 silent years, did not move from the obsidian throne where he had been holding vigil over his own unending grief. The shadows in the hall were his oldest companions, long fingers of darkness that clung to the high, vaulted ceilings and pooled in the corners like spilled ink. They were extensions of him, of the stillness that had claimed his soul the day Lyra had been torn from the world. He had ruled from this quiet place of memory ever since, his kingdom a pristine, well-oiled machine that no longer required his passion, only his presence. The whisper grew, a silken tear in the tapestry of silence. It was the scent of night-blooming jasmine and clean, cold steel. It was the rustle of leather against stone. It was the barest hint of a living, breathing pulse where none should be. His ancient, dormant senses stirred, not with alarm, but with a tired curiosity. Few were foolish enough to attempt an assault on the citadel of ash, and none had succeeded in a millennium. A flicker of movement in the periphery, faster than a mortal eye could follow. A shadow detaching itself from the greater darkness, a lithe form clad in black, moving with a dancer's deadly grace. Caius remained seated, his long fingers resting on the arm of his throne. He watched the assassin flow across the marble floor, a river of lethal intent. The figure was small, wiry, every line of their body honed to a single purpose. 2 blades, coated in the viscous, silver-sheened poison of the Order of the Silent Blade, were held in a reverse grip. They knew their craft. The poison would not kill him, but it would paralyze, incapacitate, leave him vulnerable to the final, staking blow. It was a well-conceived plan, executed with breathtaking skill. He could have ended it in a heartbeat. A thought, a gesture, and the intruder would have been a stain on the polished floor. But he did not. There was something in the assassin's carriage, a fluid economy of motion that plucked a long dormant string in the hollow of his chest. It was familiar. A ghost of a memory, a phantom of a dance he had once known. As the assassin closed the distance, leaping from the floor to the dais in a silent, soaring arc, time seemed to decelerate. The air grew thick, heavy as honey, and Caius saw the attack unfold with crystalline slowness. The blades sliced through the air, carving paths of faint light. He saw the tension in the assassin's shoulders, the absolute focus in the set of their jaw. They were a living weapon, nothing more. And then, as the steel came within an inch of his throat, their eyes met. The world shattered. It was not the face. The face was different, sharper, leaner, framed by short-cropped hair the color of midnight. The skin was pale, marked by a faint scar that bisected one eyebrow. This was the face of a killer, hard and emotionless. But the eyes. Oh, the eyes. They were the color of a stormy sea, flecked with chips of jade and silver, and in their depths, Caius saw an impossible, soul-rending truth. He saw the same light, the same constellation of spirit that had been extinguished 500 years ago. He saw her. He saw Lyra. His dead heart, a mere functional pump for half a millennium, gave a violent, painful lurch. The sound of it was a thunderclap in the sudden, absolute silence of his mind. Lyra. The name was a prayer and a curse on his internal tongue. A wave of vertigo washed over him, 5 centuries of loss and longing crashing down in a single, devastating moment. His movements were no longer driven by languid curiosity, but by a desperate, frantic need. He did not counterattack. He defended. His hand, impossibly fast, shot up and caught the assassin's wrists. Not with crushing force, but with a grip that was as unbreakable as it was gentle. The assassin's lithe body froze, suspended in mid-air, the poisoned tips of the blades a breath away from his skin. For a second, they were locked in a tableau of suspended violence. And in that second, Caius drank in the sight of her soul, shining out from behind a stranger's eyes. The shock on the assassin's face was immediate. Not fear, but a profound, unnerving confusion. The absolute certainty of their attack had crumbled. He could feel the frantic, rabbit-quick pulse hammering in her wrist beneath his fingers, a vibrant, living rhythm that he had thought he would never feel again. Lyra, he breathed. The name was a ruin, a relic excavated from the deepest part of him. It felt like rust and ash in his mouth. The assassin's eyes widened, the confusion curdling into something that looked like fear. A flicker of something else, recognition? No, it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a renewed, vicious struggle. She twisted, her body a whipcord of muscle, trying to break his hold. But it was like wrestling with a mountain. Gently, inexorably, he disarmed her. The poisoned blades clattered onto the marble, the sound unnaturally loud in the vast, still hall. He held her wrists, pulling her closer until her feet were on the dais before him. He still had not risen from his throne. He looked up at her, this impossible ghost, this deadly miracle. He could see the conditioning warring in her features, the trained emptiness fighting against the bewilderment his presence, his word, had invoked. She opened her mouth, and the voice that came out was not Lyra's warm alto, but a cold, clipped rasp. Who is Lyra? The question did not wound him. It was merely a symptom of the disease, the 500 years of separation and whatever horrors had forged this new vessel for her soul. He looked past the assassin's shell, past the hardened face and the killer's hands, and spoke to the light he saw in her eyes. You are, he said, his voice raw with a hope so terrifying it threatened to undo him completely. And you have finally come home. He released one of her wrists and raised his hand, his fingers tracing the air just before her cheek. He wanted to touch her, to feel the warmth of her skin, but he knew it would be a violation. Not yet. She was a frightened animal, a lost soul trapped in a cage of someone else's making. He saw the war within her, the instinct to kill him, the training that screamed he was the enemy, battling against an unnerving resonance that hummed between them, a string pulled taut across centuries. He saw the exact moment her training won. Her face hardened, her body coiled, and she lunged for the fallen knife. He was faster. Before she could move, a wave of his will washed over her, and she slumped, unconscious, into his waiting arms. Her weight was a solid, grounding reality. She was real. After 500 years of phantoms, she was real. He gathered her up, her slight frame impossibly precious, and rose from his throne for the first time in a century. The long wait was over. The real work had just begun. Rhys woke to the scent of lavender and old paper. It was a disorienting, cloying smell that had no place in the sterile, scentless world of her training. She expected the cold stone of a dungeon, the damp chill of a cell. Instead, she found herself on a bed of impossible softness, swathed in sheets of dark silk that felt like cool water against her skin. Her eyes snapped open. The room was not a cell. It was a cage of breathtaking luxury. A fire crackled in a marble hearth across the room, casting a warm, dancing light on walls lined with books from floor to ceiling. A thick Orbusan rug covered the floor, its intricate patterns muted in the firelight. The air was warm and still. Her weapons were gone. Her leather armor had been replaced with a simple tunic of soft gray linen. Panic, cold and sharp, sliced through the fog of her consciousness. She was on her feet in an instant, her body moving with ingrained, silent efficiency. She swept the room with her eyes, cataloguing every detail. One door, solid oak banded with iron. No visible lock, which was more worrying than a dozen bolts. A tall, arched window, glazed with thick, leaded glass, looked out onto a sheer drop, the jagged peaks of a mountain range visible against a sky choked with stars. Escape was impossible. Failure. The word was a brand on her mind, seared there by years of brutal conditioning. Failure is not an option. Failure is death. She had failed. She had reached the target, the vampire King Caius, and she had been captured. The shame was a physical illness, churning in her stomach. Her masters at the Order would have already marked her for death. A failed asset was a liability. She paced the room, a caged wolf, her bare feet silent on the plush rug. She replayed the encounter in her mind, trying to pinpoint her error. Her approach had been flawless. Her technique, perfect. But then, his eyes. His voice. The name he had used. Lyra. A meaningless sound, yet it had struck her like a physical blow, short-circuiting her focus, creating a fatal hesitation. And his touch, when he had grasped her wrists, it wasn't the crushing grip of an enemy. It had been containing. Secure. A spark of something ancient and familiar had passed between them, a jolt of recognition that had terrified her more than any threat. The heavy oak door swung inward without a sound. The king stood there, framed by the dim light of the corridor. He was taller than she remembered, a figure of long, elegant lines cloaked in shadows and sorrow. He carried a silver tray. He was not flanked by guards. He was alone. This was a tactical error, a display of arrogance. Her mind immediately began calculating angles, assessing his posture for weaknesses. She could use the tray, the edge of the table. He moved into the room, and the door swung shut behind him. He placed the tray on a small table near the fire. It held a pitcher of water, a glass, and a plate of bread and cheese. Food. He was offering her food. It was a tactic, of course. An attempt to build a rapport, to soften her. She would not fall for it. "You should eat," he said. His voice was a low, quiet resonance that seemed to sink directly into her bones, bypassing her ears. It was the same voice that had spoken that name. Rhys said nothing. She remained coiled in the center of the room, her body a loaded spring, watching his every move. He made no threatening gestures. He simply stood by the fire, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze impossibly sad. "I know you are confused," he continued, his eyes never leaving her face. "I know you do not remember. They have done a thorough job." A flicker of something cold and dangerous entered his gaze then, a glimpse of the ancient predator beneath the veneer of weary grief. It was a look that promised retribution, and for a fleeting moment, she was glad it was not directed at her. "I am an assassin of the Order of the Silent Blade," she stated, her voice flat, a recitation of her identity. "My name is Rhys. My mission was to eliminate you." "Your mission was to come home," he corrected gently. "You have simply forgotten the way. As for your name, Rhys is the name of the cage. Lyra is the name of the bird inside it." The name again. It vibrated in the air between them. She hated it. She hated the way he said it, with a reverence that felt like a physical weight. "I don't know who that is. It's a trick. A psychological manipulation." "Is it?" he asked softly. He took a step closer. She flinched, her hands instinctively curling into fists. He stopped immediately, holding up a hand in a gesture of peace. "When I touched you, when I spoke your name, what did you feel, Rhys?" She refused to answer. She would not give him that intelligence. But she couldn't stop the memory of the feeling, that dizzying jolt, the sense of falling into something vast and deep, like a forgotten dream. It was a weakness, a flaw in her conditioning that he was trying to exploit. "Your soul remembers, even if your mind does not," Caius said, his voice laced with a pain so profound it was almost beautiful. "A soul is a singular thing. It cannot be replicated. It cannot be forged. I have waited 500 years for yours to return to this world. I would know it anywhere." He was insane. A lonely, mad king who saw ghosts in his enemies. That had to be the answer. It was a more comforting thought than the alternative that the foundation of her entire existence, her training, her very name, was a lie. "You are my enemy," she snarled, the words a shield against the unnerving sincerity in his eyes. "I will kill you. The moment you show weakness, I will end you." A faint, sad smile touched his lips. It did not reach his eyes. "Then I shall have to be very careful," he said. "But you will not kill me, Lyra. You would sooner tear out your own heart. You have done it once before." He gestured again to the tray. "The food is not poisoned. The water is clean. You are not my prisoner. You are my guest. Though I concede the distinction is subtle, under the circumstances. Rest. We have a great deal of time." He turned and left as silently as he had come, the door closing with a soft click behind him. Rhys did not move for a long time. She listened to the crackle of the fire and the frantic beating of her own heart. He was a monster, a creature of the night, her target. His words were poison, designed to break her mind. She knew this. This was her truth. So why did his presence feel less like a threat, and more like the end of a long, exhausting journey? Why did this luxurious prison feel, terrifyingly, like a sanctuary? The days that followed bled into one another, each marked by the same quiet, unnerving routine. Caius would visit 3 times a day, always alone, always bringing food and water. He never tried to touch her. He rarely asked questions. He would simply sit in the chair by the fire and talk. He spoke of a world she didn't know, a time she couldn't remember. He spoke of a woman named Lyra. He didn't describe her as a long-lost queen or a figure of legend. He spoke of her in small, intimate details that painted a portrait of a person so vivid, Rhys could almost see her standing in the room. He talked about the way she would hum under her breath when she was charting stars, a slightly off-key, meandering tune. He described her infuriating habit of leaving half-finished cups of tea in every room of the castle. He spoke of her laughter, a sound he described as being like wind chimes in a summer breeze, and the memory of it made his voice crack just once. Rhys listened in hostile silence, her back pressed against the far wall, her body tensed for an attack that never came. She told herself she was gathering intelligence, studying her captor for weaknesses. But his only weakness seemed to be this ghost, this Lyra. And the more he spoke, the more the ghost began to feel real. His stories were a slow-acting poison, seeping into the cracks of her conditioning. One morning, he arrived not with a tray, but with a single, perfect stargazer lily in a slender crystal vase. He set it on the mantelpiece. The scent, sweet and heady, filled the room. These were her favorite, he said, his back to her. She said they held the entire night sky in their petals. Rhys stared at the flower. Its vibrant pink edges bled into a creamy white center, its petals dusted with a fine, glittering pollen. A sudden, sharp pain lanced through her temple. She squeezed her eyes shut, a wave of dizziness washing over her. For a split second, she saw an image in her mind's eye, a woman's hand, not her own, reaching out to touch that same flower, its petals soft as silk against her fingertips. The vision was gone in a flash, leaving behind a phantom sensation and a throbbing headache. "What did you do to me?" she rasped, her hand flying to her head. Caius turned, his expression a mixture of pain and hope. "I did nothing. You are remembering." "It's a trick," she yelled, her voice raw. "Some kind of magic, a mental assault." "The only assault," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow, "was the one that made you forget." He left her alone with the flower. She wanted to smash it, to destroy the vase and grind the petals under her heel. But she couldn't. She found herself watching it for hours, its cloying sent a constant, unnerving presence. That night, she dreamt of a field of lilies under a sky full of unfamiliar constellations. She dreamt of a hand in hers, large and cool, and a voice whispering her name. Not Rhys. The other name. When she woke, the silk pillowcase was damp with tears she didn't remember shedding. The next day, he brought a book. It was bound in worn, blue leather, its title stamped in faded gold leaf. Sonnets of the Celestial Sphere. She loved poetry, he said, placing it on the table beside her untouched food. But she claimed the poets never got the stars right. She said they were too busy being romantic to be accurate. A fond, ghostly smile touched his lips. She was going to write her own. A scientifically accurate book of poetry. She was a wonderful contradiction. Rhys refused to look at the book. But after he was gone, the silence of the room seemed to amplify its presence. It lay there, a silent accusation. Her training screamed at her to ignore it, to see it as another tool of his manipulation. But a deeper, quieter curiosity was beginning to stir, a traitorous whisper in the back of her mind. She remembered her own training. Flashes of it came back to her, stark and brutal, a chilling contrast to the quiet gentleness of this room. She remembered the master of blades, a man with eyes like chips of flint, demonstrating a killing blow on a training dummy, then on a live prisoner. She remembered the long hours of sensory deprivation, designed to purge all emotional responses, to hone her into a tool of pure function. She remembered the catechisms, repeated until they became her only reality. The order is your life. The mission is your purpose. Emotion is a flaw. Identity is a weakness. They had built her from the ground up, piece by painful piece. They had given her a name, a purpose. And this man, this ancient monster, was trying to undo it all with a flower and a book of poems. The absurdity of it was galling. The efficacy of it was terrifying. Late that night, when the fire had burned down to glowing embers, she finally gave in. She crept to the table and picked up the book. The leather was soft and supple under her fingertips. It felt right. As if her hands knew its shape. She opened it to a random page. The poem was about the constellation Cygnus. The words were elegant, but as she read them, a thought surfaced, unbidden and sharp. He has the wing angle all wrong. And he's missed the lesser stars entirely. The thought was so clear, so authoritative, and so utterly alien that she dropped the book as if it had burned her. It landed on the rug with a soft thud. She backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs. That wasn't her thought. She knew nothing of constellations beyond their use in navigation. That was the voice of someone else. The voice of the ghost. The voice of Lyra. The first cracks were appearing in the fortress of her identity, and she was terrified of what might come pouring through. He announced it as a simple statement of fact, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "You will dine with me this evening." Rhys, who had been methodically testing the tensile strength of the silk curtains, froze. "No." It was not a request, Caius replied, his voice still gentle, but with an underlying firmness that reminded her he was a king, and she was, for all the soft furnishings, his captive. "I grow tired of eating alone. It has been 500 years. Indulge me." The dining hall was as grand and imposing as the throne room, but warmer. A single long table of dark, polished wood stretched the length of the room, capable of seating 100. Tonight, it was set for only 2, at one end, so close they could have reached out and touched. The intimacy was a greater threat than any legion of guards. A fire roared in a hearth large enough to roast an ox, and a dozen silver candelabras cast a flickering, golden glow over the scene. Rhys was a discordant note in the opulent harmony. She wore the same simple linen tunic, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. She refused to sit until he did, her body held in a state of rigid readiness. He gestured to the chair opposite him, then took his own seat. Reluctantly, she sat, perching on the edge of the velvet-cushioned chair as if poised for flight. Servants, silent and spectral, moved in and out of the shadows, placing dishes on the table. Roasted fowl, fresh bread, dark wine in a crystal decanter for him, water for her. And silver. Every utensil, every platter, every goblet was gleaming, heavy silver. A test. A reminder of what he was, and what she was supposed to do to him. Her hand rested on the hilt of the silver knife beside her plate. It was perfectly weighted, balanced for throwing. She could feel its cold promise against her palm. Caius seemed not to notice. He ate with a slow, deliberate grace, his eyes watching her over the rim of his wine goblet. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken things. It was a battle of wills, and Rhys was determined not to lose. She would not eat. She would not speak. She would be a black hole of resistance at his table. She loved to watch the stars from the eastern battlements, he said suddenly, his voice soft in the cavernous room. Even in the dead of winter. She would wrap herself in furs and stay out for hours, tracking the movements of the planets. She claimed she could hear them singing. Rhys flinched. He was doing it again. Weaving tales of this ghost, this Lyra, trying to ensnare her in memories that were not her own. "I had an observatory built for her," he continued, a faint, nostalgic smile on his lips. "The finest in the known world. Lenses ground from pure crystal, an astrolabe of dwarven silver and gold. She spent more time there than she did with me." In the end he sighed, a sound like rustling leaves. "I have not unsealed the doors since she died." Rhys stared at him, her hand tightening on the knife. Why was he telling her this? Was it to make her feel sympathy? To make him seem less like a monster? Her training provided the answer. It was a tactic. He was creating a persona, a sympathetic character, to lower her guard. "Your stories mean nothing to me," she said, her voice cold and even. "I know," he replied, and the simple sadness in his voice was more disarming than any argument. "I do not tell them for you, not entirely. I tell them for me." To hear her name spoken aloud in this hall again. It is a novelty. They fell back into silence. She watched him, cataloguing the way the candlelight carved shadows under his high cheekbones, the unnatural stillness of his posture, the ancient sorrow that seemed to cling to him like a shroud. He was the enemy. He was the monster she had been created to destroy. Her entire life, from the first moment of consciousness she could recall, had been geared toward this one purpose, ending the life of the man sitting across from her. And yet, there was a resonance. An infuriating, undeniable pull. When he spoke of the stars, an image had flashed in her mind, a sky wider and more brilliant than any she had ever seen. When he spoke of the cold, she had felt a phantom chill, the ghost of a fur cloak wrapped around her shoulders. Her body was betraying her mind. Her soul, if such a thing existed, was betraying her training. She ate. She didn't know why. Perhaps to spite his expectation that she wouldn't. Or perhaps because a deep, gnawing hunger had finally overwhelmed her resolve. She picked up the bread, her movements stiff and angry, and tore off a piece. It was fresh and warm. She ate it mechanically, without tasting it, her eyes never leaving his. He inclined his head, a small, quiet acknowledgement. It was not a look of triumph, but of something more complex. Relief, perhaps. Later that night, back in her gilded cage, Rhys found she could not settle. The king's words echoed in her mind. She loved to watch the stars. It was a meaningless piece of information, a detail about a dead woman. It should not have mattered. But she was drawn to the tall, arched window. She pressed her forehead against the cool, thick glass and looked out. The sky was a sweep of black velvet, punctured by the diamond-sharp points of a million distant suns. She didn't know their names. She didn't know their patterns. To her, they were merely navigational aids, cold and remote. But as she stared, a strange, unfamiliar ache bloomed in her chest. A longing for something she couldn't name. A feeling of profound, cosmic loneliness, as if she were a fallen star, light-years from her rightful place in the heavens. The seed of doubt, planted by a ghost story, was beginning to take root in the barren ground of her soul. The whispers began as a subtle shift in the castle's atmosphere. Rhys could feel it, even from her isolated room. A current of unease, of curiosity, that followed in Caius's wake. The spectral servants seemed to pause longer in the doorways. The guards she sometimes glimpsed in the halls held a new tension in their shoulders. The king, who had been a fixed, unchanging monument for centuries, had brought a living, breathing anomaly into their midst. And the court was stirring. The proof of it came in the form of a visitor. Not to her, but to Caius. Rhys was at her window when she saw him arrive in the courtyard below, a tall, stooped figure in robes of deep indigo, his long white hair a stark contrast against the dark fabric. He moved with the slow, deliberate gait of the very old, even for a vampire. She watched as Caius met him at the entrance, the two of them conversing in low tones before disappearing inside. There was a gravity to their meeting, a sense of ancient counsel being sought. Hours later, Caius came to her room. He looked weary. A new line of tension was etched between his brows. He did not bring food. He did not sit. He stood in the center of the room and looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. "That was my seneschal, Marius," he said, his voice flat. "He has served me for 900 years. He is loyal. He is also concerned. He wishes to know why I am keeping a mortal assassin alive within the heart of my fortress. The rest of my court shares his curiosity." "You should have let me kill you," Rhys said. "It would have been simpler." "Simpler, perhaps," he agreed. "But infinitely emptier. They do not understand. They see you, a trained killer from an order that has hunted our kind for generations. They see a threat. A folly." He took a step closer, his eyes pleading with her to understand. "I see Lyra's soul trapped inside a weapon forged by my enemies. I see the greatest cruelty the fates could devise." He stopped before her, so close she could see the flecks of silver in his dark eyes. "They call you Rhys. It means order, rashness, a name for a weapon to be aimed and fired. A name with no history, no substance. It is a label, not an identity." He reached out, slowly, giving her time to pull away. She stood her ground, her body rigid. His fingers, cool and firm, gently tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Your name is Lyra," he whispered, and the name was an incantation, a key turning in a lock deep inside her. It means harper name for music, for art, for the beauty that connects the heavens and the earth. It is the name of a woman who taught a jaded king how to look at the stars again. It is the name of my wife. The word wife struck her with the force of a physical blow. A wave of vertigo so profound she swayed on her feet. His hand shot out to steady her, his grip firm on her arm. The contact was grounding, but the world was tilting on its axis. Liar, she breathed, but the word had no conviction. It was a desperate prayer against a rising tide of impossibility. Your soul knows the truth of it, he insisted, his voice raw. Let it speak. Stop fighting it. And then it happened. A memory. Not a phantom sensation or a vague emotion, but a clear, sharp, crystalline fragment of a life that was not hers. A mirror. A vast, silver-gilt mirror in a room full of sunlight. A woman staring back from its surface. A woman with long, dark hair that fell in waves to her waist, and eyes the color of a stormy sea. Her own eyes, but not her own face. The woman in the mirror smiled, and a voice, her own voice but not her own voice, whispered a name. Lyra. The vision shattered as quickly as it came, leaving Reese gasping, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She stumbled back, away from him, her hand pressed to her mouth. The image was burned onto the inside of her eyelids. The name echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of her mind. What was that? She whispered, her voice trembling. She was terrified. The solid ground of her identity was crumbling into dust beneath her feet. Everything she knew, everything she was a lie. But if she wasn't Reese, who was she? The ghost in the mirror? The woman in the king's stories? The thought was madness. It is the beginning, Caius said, his voice thick with a hope that was almost painful to witness. It is the first true memory. The first stone of the prison falling away. He looked at her, this broken, terrified creature, and his expression was one of infinite tenderness. He saw not the assassin who had tried to kill him, but the lost soul struggling toward the light. Do not be afraid, my love, he said, the endearment slipping out, as natural as breathing. I am here. I will not let you fall. But she was already falling, tumbling into a chasm between two lives, two identities, and she did not know if she would ever find the bottom. He took her to the observatory. The doors were sealed not with locks, but with his will, a silent, invisible barrier that had held for 5 centuries. As they approached down the long, dust-choked corridor at the top of the highest tower, Reese felt a palpable pressure against her skin, a ward of sorrow and preservation. Caius reached out, placing his palm flat against the heavy, iron-banded wood. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, a wave of profound grief washed out from him, so potent it made her gasp. Then, with a low groan of ancient hinges, the doors swung inward. The air that billowed out was stale, thick with the dust of ages, yet it carried a faint, lingering scent of parchment, beeswax, and dried herbs. It smelled of quiet contemplation. They stepped inside. The room was circular, its ceiling a magnificent dome of glass, now opaque with grime. Moonlight struggled through in faint, milky beams, illuminating a universe of dust motes dancing in the still air. A great, brass and silver telescope, tarnished with age, stood in the center of the room, aimed at a patch of sky where a constellation must have been 500 years ago. Charts and scrolls were stacked on tables, their edges curled and yellowed. Half-empty inkwells had long since dried up. A single chair was pulled up to a large desk, as if its occupant had just stepped away for a moment. It was a tomb. A perfect, untouched monument to a life cut short. This was her sanctuary, Caius said, his voice a low whisper, as if afraid to disturb the sleeping silence. He moved through the room with a kind of reverence, his fingers ghosting over the surfaces of tables and shelves, leaving clean trails in the thick dust. This was where she unraveled the secrets of the universe. Reese stood just inside the doorway, overwhelmed. The sense of presence here was staggering. It wasn't just a room, it was an imprint, a lingering psychic echo of the person who had inhabited it. She could almost feel the quiet intensity, the focused passion of the astronomer who had worked here. She felt like an intruder, a profanity in a sacred space. Caius stopped before a large, intricate device on a pedestal. It was an astrolabe, a complex web of interlocking rings and dials made of gold and silver, studded with tiny chips of sapphire and emerald to mark the major stars. Despite the dust, it still held a faint, inner gleam. "I had this made for her," he murmured, tracing one of the golden rings. She called it her celestial engine. She could chart the next 1,000 years of celestial movement with it. She was brilliant. Far more brilliant than I. He looked at Reese, and his eyes were full of the past. "You would stand here for hours, your head bent, muttering to yourself about parallax and precession. You had a small smudge of ink that was always on your left cheek." The words were meant to be gentle, to coax another memory to the surface. But for Reese, they were an attack. He was trying to write this ghost's life over her own. He was trying to erase Reese. The panic and confusion that had been simmering inside her boiled over into sudden, violent rage. "Stop it," she screamed, the sound shocking in the profound silence. "Stop trying to make me into her. I am not her." In a blind fury, she lunged forward, her hands outstretched. She wasn't aiming for him. She was aiming for the astrolabe. For this beautiful, intricate symbol of a life that was not hers. If she could destroy it, she could destroy the ghost. Her fingers brushed the cold metal, her intent to shove it from its pedestal, to see it shatter on the stone floor. He moved in a blur. One moment he was across the room, the next he was there, his hands closing over hers, stopping her. His grip was not violent, but it was absolute, a cage of cool, firm flesh around her own. The shock of the contact was electric, a circuit completed. It jolted up her arms and straight into her chest. He held her hands pressed against the cold, intricate surface of the astrolabe. They stood frozen, breathing heavily in the dusty air. Her rage dissipated as quickly as it had come, drained away by the sheer, stunning power of his touch. It wasn't just physical strength. It was a connection. A deep, humming resonance that vibrated from his hands into hers, through the metal of the astrolabe, and into the very core of her being. For a long, suspended moment, the world fell away. She wasn't Reese, the assassin. She wasn't Lyra, the ghost. She was just a consciousness, tethered to another, adrift in a sea of silent stars. She could feel the echo of his 500 years of loneliness, a pain so vast it had its own gravity. And beneath it, a love that was just as immense, an unyielding, elemental force. It was terrifying and beautiful, and it was all directed at her. At the soul he saw inside her. He slowly, gently, loosened his grip. He did not let go entirely, but his hands slid from hers to her wrists. He turned her to face him. Her head was bowed, her hair hiding her face. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice soft but firm. She lifted her head. Her eyes were wide, her face a mask of confusion and fear. The anger was gone, replaced by a raw, terrifying vulnerability. The assassin was gone. The girl beneath it was visible for the first time. "I am not trying to erase you," he said, his voice aching with sincerity. "I am trying to help you find the part of yourself that was stolen. Reese is the mask. I want to help you take it off." He let her go. The contact was broken. The humming ceased, leaving a strange emptiness in its wake. Reese stumbled back, her hands trembling. She looked from his grieving face to the beautiful, complex machine she had almost destroyed. She felt a phantom ache in her cheek, the ghost of an ink smudge. The moment was broken, but the memory of the connection, the feeling of his soul pressed against hers, was not erased. It was a new crack in the wall, wider and more dangerous than any that had come before. The garden was her last memory. He must have known. He led her down a winding stone staircase that spiraled deep into the castle's foundations, ending at a small, unassuming iron door. It was rusted shut, a thick curtain of ivy covering it completely. Caius tore the ivy away with one hand and placed his palm on the door. With a screech of protesting metal, the lock gave way, and he pushed it open. A wave of cool, damp air washed over them, carrying the scent of rich earth, decaying leaves, and the faint, ghostly perfume of roses. They stepped through the doorway and into a place out of time. It was a walled garden, open to the sky, but so perfectly enclosed by the castle's ancient walls that it felt like a secret room. Neglect had reigned here for centuries. What must have once been neatly trimmed hedges were now wild, monstrous things. Flower beds were choked with weeds, and stone paths were cracked and overrun with moss. But it was not dead. It was teeming with a wild, untamed life. In the center of the garden, a single rosebush had grown into a sprawling, thorny behemoth, its gnarled branches reaching out in every direction. And it was covered, impossibly, in dozens of deep, velvety crimson blooms. She built this place, Caius said, his voice hushed. She called it her patch of earth, a place to remember what it felt like to be mortal, to be tied to the seasons. He walked slowly down the overgrown path, his feet silent on the mossy stones. Rhys followed, her senses on high alert. The place felt charged, humming with a latent energy, like the air before a lightning strike. Everything was so intensely green, so vibrantly alive. It was a stark contrast to the stone and shadow of the rest of the castle. Everything in here, she planted herself, he murmured, gesturing to the wild tangle. She said that a king of stone and night needed a queen of soil and sunlight to keep him balanced. He stopped before the monstrous rosebush. He reached out, his long, pale fingers surprisingly gentle as they brushed against a perfect, half-opened bud. This was the first thing she planted. A black baccarat rose. She said its petals were the color of a vampire's heart after it had learned to love. Rhys stared at the rose. The color was so deep it was almost black, the petals like rich velvet. The scent coming from it was intoxicating, a heady blend of spice and sweetness. It pulled at something inside her, a thread of familiarity so faint it was almost imperceptible. She would be furious to see it so overgrown, Caius said with a sad chuckle. She was a ruthless pruner. She believed you had to be cruel to be kind, sometimes. That dead wood had to be cut away to make room for new growth. He turned to look at her, his eyes dark with meaning. A lesson, perhaps. He was pushing her, she knew. Gently, patiently, but relentlessly. He was surrounding her with the artifacts of Lyra's life, hoping the cumulative weight would finally break the dam of her conditioning. And it was working. She felt unsteady, adrift. The world of Rhys, of discipline, of missions, of a singular, murderous purpose, felt thin and brittle, a false front threatening to collapse. She took a hesitant step toward the rosebush, drawn by an impulse she didn't understand. The phantom smell of roses she had experienced before was now a reality, thick and overwhelming. It made her dizzy. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers hovering just above a velvety petal. She was afraid to touch it. Afraid of what might happen. It's all right, Caius whispered from behind her. Don't be afraid to remember. His voice gave her the last push she needed. She closed her eyes and let her fingers brush against the petal. It was like plunging into ice water. The world dissolved. The garden, the castle, Caius, it all vanished. She was somewhere else. Someone else. Sunlight. Warm and golden on her bare arms. Laughter, rich and joyful, bubbling up from her own throat. She is kneeling in the dirt, her hands covered in soil, a small trowel in her grasp. A shadow falls over her, and she looks up, squinting against the light. Caius is standing there, but he is different. Younger. The sorrow has not yet carved such deep lines into his face. He is smiling, a genuine, breathtaking smile of pure happiness. He holds out a hand to her. Come, my love, he says, his voice warm and full of affection. Leave the dirt for a while. Dance with me. She takes his hand. His fingers, cool and strong, intertwine with hers. Her hand. It is hers. She knows it with an absolute certainty that shakes her to her core. This is not a vision. This is a memory. The memory ended. Rhys was back in the overgrown garden, on her knees in the damp earth, gasping for breath. The sensory detail of the memory was so vivid, so complete, that its loss was a physical blow. The warmth of the sun on her skin, the feel of his hand in hers, the sound of her own laughter, it was all gone, leaving behind a hollow, aching void. She was shaking violently, her whole body trembling with the aftershock. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. She wasn't crying from sadness or fear. She was crying from the sheer, overwhelming force of it. The memory was real. It was true. Which meant her entire life as Rhys was the lie. The Order hadn't just trained her. They had hollowed her out and built something new inside. They had stolen her name, her face, her life. They had stolen her from him. Caius, she whispered, the name feeling strange and yet perfectly familiar on her tongue. He was there in an instant, kneeling in front of her, his hands hovering, unsure if he should touch her. His face was a mask of agonizing hope. Lyra, he breathed. She looked up at him, her vision blurred by tears. She saw him. For the first time, she saw the man from her memory, the man whose hand fit so perfectly in hers. The conditioning was still there, a cage of cold iron around her heart, but she could now see the bars. She knew she was a prisoner. I remember, she stammered, the words feeling inadequate to describe the cataclysm that had just occurred within her. The sun. Your hand. The look of relief that washed over his features was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was like watching a dawn break after an endless night. He finally reached out, his thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. The touch was no longer a jolt. It was an anchor. The identity of Rhys was fracturing, the pieces falling away. And in the ruins, something new, something ancient and powerful, was beginning to stir. The attack came without warning. It was a violation of the castle's ancient peace, a brutal slash of violence against a tapestry of quiet grief. The Order of the Silent Blade did not tolerate failure. Rhys had been their most promising asset, honed over 2 decades into the perfect weapon. Her failure to eliminate Caius, followed by her complete disappearance, had marked her not just as a failure, but as a compromised agent, a potential source of intelligence that could be turned against them. They had come not to rescue her, but to sanitize their mistake. And they had come for the original target as well. They breached the Citadel's defenses through a forgotten aqueduct, a relic of a time before Caius's reign, a flaw in the castle's otherwise impenetrable security. They moved with the same silent, deadly grace as Rhys, a dozen shadows armed with poisoned silver and a fanatic's resolve. Caius and Rhys were in the Grand Library, a chamber even larger than her room, filled with the accumulated knowledge of 3 millennia. He had been showing her a star chart Lyra had drawn by hand, his finger tracing the lines of a constellation, his voice a low murmur as he told her its story. The memory of the garden had left Rhys in a fragile, limpid state. The walls between her 2 selves were thin as paper, and she felt adrift, clinging to the quiet solidity of his presence. The first sign of trouble was a subtle shift in the air pressure, a flicker of the candles in their sconces. Caius went still, his head lifting, his senses extending like an invisible net through the castle. His expression went from nostalgic tenderness to cold, lethal fury in the space of a heartbeat. "They're here," he said, his voice a low growl. "Who?" Rhys asked, her own instinct screaming, her body automatically shifting into a defensive posture. "Your masters." Before she could process the words, the library's great oaken doors burst inward, splintering into 1,000 pieces. 3 figures, clad in the familiar black leather of the Order, flowed into the room, fanning out, their silver blades gleaming in the candlelight. Caius moved. He was no longer the grieving scholar, the patient lover. He became a blur of motion, a force of nature. He shoved Rhys behind him, putting his body between her and the attackers, a purely instinctual, protective gesture. One of the assassins lunged, his blade aimed at Caius's heart. Caius's hand shot out, catching the man's wrist and twisting. The sound of snapping bone was like a pistol shot in the suddenly silent library. He threw the man's body into the other 2, sending them stumbling back. "Get behind the shelves," he commanded Rhys, not taking his eyes off the intruders. But Rhys was frozen. Her body was screaming at her to fight, to defend, but her mind was a battlefield. The sight of the Order's insignia, the familiar posture of the assassins, the glint of their silver blades, it triggered a deep, Pavlovian response. "These are your brothers. The king is the target. Complete the mission." The conditioning, the bedrock of her existence, roared back to life, a desperate last stand against the encroaching memories of Lyra. She was paralyzed, caught between 2 warring imperatives. More assassins poured into the room, their numbers overwhelming. Caius was magnificent. He moved like a phantom, a whirlwind of controlled violence. He was faster, stronger than any of them. But there were too many. And they were prepared. They herded him, using coordinated attacks to force him into a corner, limiting his inhuman speed. He fought with a terrible, silent fury, his movements economical and deadly. But for every one he disabled, two more seemed to take their place. Rhys watched, her fists clenched, a silent scream trapped in her throat. She saw an assassin slip past Caius's guard, his blade slicing across the king's back. Caius didn't cry out, but he staggered, a dark line appearing on his tunic. The poison. It wouldn't kill him, but it would slow him down, dull his senses. They were whittling away at him. And through it all, his priority was her. He kept maneuvering, even at a tactical disadvantage, to keep his body between her and the fight. He was protecting the woman who had come to kill him from the people who had sent her. The sheer, selfless folly of it was a dagger in her heart. A new figure appeared in the shattered doorway. This one was different. Older, taller, with a face like a death mask. He carried no sword, but a heavy, ornate crossbow. The bolt was not silver, but carved from a gnarled, pale wood. Ashwood. Laced with the concentrated venom of a dozen different poisons. A weapon designed not just to paralyze, but to kill. To send even an ancient vampire into the final, dreamless sleep. Rhys knew him. The Grand Master of the Order. The man who had personally overseen the final stages of her training. The man who had forged her into a weapon. The Grand Master raised the crossbow, aiming it squarely at Caius's chest. The other assassins fell back, creating a clear line of fire. Caius was occupied, fending off two attackers at once. He was wounded, slowed. He didn't see the new threat. Rhys saw it. She saw the Grand Master's finger tighten on the trigger. She saw the absolute certainty of death in his eyes. In that moment, the world slowed to a crawl. She saw Caius turn, his eyes widening as he finally registered the danger. But it was too late. He was too far away, his movements sluggish from the poison. He was going to die. And something inside Rhys broke. The conditioning, the years of brutal training, the carefully constructed identity of the assassin named Rhys, it was a cage of iron and lies. But the sight of him, her king, her love, about to be extinguished before her very eyes, was a force more powerful than any brainwashing. The love she had felt in the garden, the connection from the observatory, the echo of 500 years of waiting, it all coalesced into a single, explosive point of pure, unadulterated rage. The cage shattered. Not piece by piece, but all at once, in a cataclysm of light and memory. The name Rhys was burned away like chaff in a fire. The mission, the order, the lies, all of it turned to ash. A flood of memories, a torrent of a life lived and lost, came rushing in. Laughter in a sunlit garden. Whispers in a dark observatory. The heat of his body next to hers in a cold bed. The terror of a human war. The pain of a mortal wound. The promise he had made to her as she lay dying, I will find you again. I will wait. However long it takes. She was Lyra. She had always been Lyra. The crossbow fired. The sound was a dull thud. The ashwood bolt flew, a streak of pale death aimed at Caius's heart. Lyra moved. She was no longer the rigid, precise assassin. She was a storm. Her body, honed by the Order's training, was now guided by an older, more instinctual knowledge, and fueled by 5 centuries of stored love and fury. She crossed the distance between them in 2 impossible strides, a blur of grey linen. She didn't try to block the bolt. She didn't have time. She threw herself in front of Caius. The bolt struck her in the shoulder, the impact spinning her around, the force of it slamming her back against his chest. A searing, white-hot pain exploded through her, but it was distant, unimportant. She felt his arms come around her, his body a solid wall at her back. Lyra. His voice was a strangled cry of disbelief and agony. She looked up, over her wounded shoulder, at the Grand Master. His face was a mask of cold shock. He had failed. He had hit the wrong target. You will not touch him, she snarled, and the voice that came out was hers. Her true voice. Not the cold rasp of Rhys, but the clear, ringing alto of Lyra, filled with the authority of a queen. The pain from the poisoned bolt was a fire in her veins, but it was nothing compared to the inferno of her rage. Her soul, finally free, seized the weapon her body had become and turned it against its makers. She pushed away from Caius, pulling the bolt from her own shoulder with a grunt of pain, and faced her former masters. Her fighting style was no longer the cold, calculated geometry of the order. It was a dance. A fluid, intuitive, and utterly lethal storm of movement that was both beautiful and terrifying to behold. She moved with the grace of a river and the ferocity of a wildfire. Caius, stunned for only a moment by her sacrifice and her transformation, let out a roar of pure, primal fury. The last vestiges of the poison were burned away by the heat of his rage. He moved to her side, and for the first time in 500 years, they fought together. It was not a battle. It was a reckoning. They moved as one, a seamless whirlwind of darkness and light. He was the unyielding mountain, the crushing force of ages. She was the swift, flowing river that surrounded and eroded all in its path. His strength was absolute, her speed was deceptive. Where he met force with overwhelming force, she simply wasn't there, redirecting an enemy's lunge with a flick of her wrist, her borrowed silver knife finding the weak points in their armor. The remaining assassins, trained to fight a single, powerful target, were utterly unprepared for the devastating synergy of the king and his reborn queen. They had expected to sanitize a mistake. Instead, they had walked into the heart of a legend. Lyra's mind was a torrent of sensation. The pain in her shoulder was a dull, constant throb, a reminder of her mortality, but her body felt alive, alight with purpose. Every movement was instinct, guided by memories of sparring with Caius in another life, a playful dance that had now become deadly earnest. She saw the Grand Master, his face pale with disbelief and fury, trying to reload his crossbow. "He is mine," she said to Caius, her voice low and dangerous. Caius nodded, turning his attention to the last two assassins, dispatching them with a brutal efficiency that was terrifying to behold. He tore the sword from one's hand and drove it through the heart of the other, his eyes burning with cold fire. Lyra advanced on the Grand Master. He fumbled with the heavy ashwood bolt, his composure finally broken. He had created a weapon to kill a god, and that weapon had turned on him. The irony was fatal. "You took my life," Lyra said, her steps silent on the book-strewn floor. "You stole my name. You tried to turn me into a monster. You were nothing," he spat, finally slotting the bolt into place. "A blank slate. We gave you purpose. You gave me a cage," she corrected, her voice soft as silk and sharp as steel. "And my king just gave me the key." He raised the crossbow, but she was already moving. She flowed under his aim, her hand striking his wrist with the precise, stunning force of a snake, making him drop the weapon. Her other hand, holding the silver knife she'd retrieved, came up in a fluid arc. It was not a killing blow. It was a statement. The blade sliced through the leather straps of his armor, severing the clasps, and his breastplate clattered to the floor. She pressed the cold point of the knife against the order's insignia tattooed over his heart. He froze, his eyes wide with fear. He had spent a lifetime turning humans into unfeeling weapons. He had forgotten what it was to feel fear himself. "My name is Lyra," she said, her sea-storm eyes boring into his. "I am the queen of this court. And you are trespassing." She did not kill him. Death was too clean an ending. With a final, contemptuous look, she spun away, leaving him disarmed and broken in the center of the ruined library. Caius's royal guard, finally alerted to the breach, came pouring into the room, their swords drawn. They stopped short, taking in the scene of carnage, the bodies of the assassins, the furious king, and the unknown woman in a simple linen tunic, bleeding from a grievous shoulder wound but standing tall and unbowed beside him. In the quiet aftermath, surrounded by the wreckage and the bodies of their enemies, Lyra turned to Caius. The adrenaline of the fight faded, and a wave of dizziness from the poison and blood loss washed over her. He was there in an instant, his arms supporting her, holding her with a desperate tenderness. "Lyra," he breathed, his forehead pressing against hers. He looked into her eyes, searching, and what he found there made his own eyes shine with unshed tears. It was her. All of it. Her wit, her fire, her love. It was all back, shining out, unobscured by the shadow of Reese. "Caius," she whispered, her hand coming up to cup his cheek. His skin was cool, like marble, but she could feel the life, the love, thrumming beneath it. You waited. You foolish, stubborn, wonderful man. You actually waited. I promised, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I always keep my promises to you. All the memories were there now, a complete tapestry woven from 2 lifetimes. She remembered their first meeting, her fascination with the lonely, serious vampire king. She remembered their arguments, their laughter, their quiet moments in the observatory. And she remembered the end. The fire, the war, the stray arrow that had taken her life. She remembered the agony on his face as he held her, the vow he had made over her dying body. He had kept it. Through 5 centuries of silence and grief, he had waited for her soul to return. He swept her up into his arms, as easily as if she were a child. The poison, he began, his voice tight with worry as he looked at the dark, ugly wound in her shoulder. It hurts, she admitted, her head resting against his chest, the steady, silent rhythm of his heart a comforting presence. But it feels distant. As if it's happening to someone else. She looked up at him, a faint, weary smile on her lips. I think the part of me it's trying to kill is already dead. Reese is gone. He carried her from the library, past his stunned and silent guards, through the long corridors of the castle that were now her home, once again. He took her back to the room that had been her prison, but now felt like a haven. He laid her gently on the silk sheets and tended to her wound, his touch infinitely careful. He cleansed it, his vampiric saliva neutralizing the worst of the ancient poisons, and bound it with clean linen. When he was done, he sat on the edge of the bed, simply looking at her, as if afraid she might vanish if he blinked. I have a choice to offer you, he said, his voice quiet and serious. The one I could not give you before. Your soul has returned to a mortal body. It will age. It will die. Again the pain in his voice as he said that last word was immense. I will not lose you again, Lyra. But the choice must be yours. I can make you like me. We can have the eternity that was stolen from us. She looked at him, at this magnificent, lonely king who had loved her across the span of death itself. She thought of the fleeting, fragile beauty of her human life, and the vast, unending expanse of his. There was no hesitation. There was no choice, not really. Her life was with him. Her eternity was with him. You once told me, she said, her voice growing stronger, that a king of stone and night needed a queen of soil and sunlight. But I think, this time, I would like to learn the music of the stars with you. For a very, very long time. Tears of pure joy, the first he had shed in half a millennium, traced paths down his cheeks. He leaned down and kissed her, a kiss that was not about passion, but about homecoming. It was a kiss that sealed a 500-year-old promise, a kiss that bridged the chasm of death and time. It was the beginning of an eternity. Her transformation was a quiet, sacred thing. It was not violent or monstrous. It was a transference of love, of life, of eternity itself. He held her in his arms, her head cradled in the crook of his neck, and she felt the gentle, sharp pressure of his fangs against her skin. It was not a bite of hunger, but of giving. A flood of warmth and power poured into her, chasing away the last of the poison, mending her wound, and remaking her, cell by cell, into something more. She felt her heart beat its last human rhythm and then, after a moment of profound silence, begin a new, stronger, steadier cadence. The cadence of forever. When she opened her eyes, the world was new. The colors of the room were deeper, more vibrant. She could see the individual fibers in the tapestry on the wall, hear the faint whisper of a breeze against the windowpane miles away. She looked at Caius, truly seeing him for the first time with her new senses, and the sheer, ancient beauty of him took her breath away. He helped her to her feet. She was no longer weak. She felt a strength, a vitality, she had never known. She was herself, and yet, she was more. He led her to a tall mirror, and she saw her reflection. It was the face of Reese, the assassin, but it was no longer a mask. It was her face now, infused with a new light, a new life. Her sea-storm eyes held the wisdom of 2 lifetimes and the promise of an infinite future. He took her hand. The court is waiting, he said. They are confused. They saw an assassin. They need to see their queen. Together, they walked from the room, their steps in perfect sync. They moved through the great halls of the citadel of Ash, no longer king and captive, but as equals, two halves of a single soul finally reunited. They came to the great balcony overlooking the throne room, where the entire Knights' Court was assembled, their silent, immortal faces turned upward in confusion and anticipation. Caius stepped forward, with Lyra at his side. He did not need to raise his voice. His words filled the hall, resonant with power and a joy that none of his subjects had heard in centuries. For 500 years, this court has been in mourning, he declared. Tonight, the mourning ends. Your queen has returned. He raised her hand, their fingers intertwined, a symbol of their unbreakable bond. A murmur went through the assembled vampires, a wave of shock and dawning wonder. They saw their king, no longer a figure of sorrow and shadow, but a monarch alight with a fierce, protective love. And they saw the woman beside him, a stranger with a familiar soul shining in her eyes, a queen who had conquered death itself to return to her throne. Lyra looked out at the sea of faces, and felt no fear. This was her home. These were her people. This was her life. She looked up at Caius, her king, her husband, her eternity. He smiled down at her, a true smile that finally reached his ancient, loving eyes. The sun was rising outside the castle walls, its first rays striking the high windows, but for the first time in 500 years, it did not herald another day of sorrow. It was the dawn of their new, unending life. Together,